Hi everyone! With the remake coming out, I've been getting more and more anxious concerning Final Fantasy VII. I've been playing the game, watching some playthroughs, and getting back to that age-old ritual, shipping wars. However, I noticed that all conversations and videos on the topic were basically the same. They're either trying to compare Cloud's behavior, or else try to one-up each other with statements by developers. None of them seem to take the viewpoint of a storyteller and how the game uses certain narrative techniques and why. Most importantly, no person I've seen talking about this took the time to separate the narrative, the plot, and the story of the game, nor analyze how internal and external conflicts work together to create the plot. So in light of the imminent release of the remake, I thought I'd give my perspective as someone who studied game design and narratology as his bachelor and is now doing a master in the same field. Now, I'm gonna be upfront about this. This analysis of Final Fantasy VII will end with the conclusion that not only is Tifa Lockhart the main female love interest in the plot, but I will argue that the much talked about love triangle of Final Fantasy VII isn't actually even a part of the plot. If that concept seems ludicrous enough for you to refuse to listen to anything else I have to say, then by all means, turn off the video. But if you have an open mind, I think I can explain why the love triangle is actually a part of the narrative and not the plot. Although this will probably be a long video with a crappy microphone, no video editing experience, and a horrendous Dutch accent, I nevertheless still hope that someone will find it interesting. And I hope it will help me better my own understanding as well, since I admit that these are difficult concepts to really grasp. I just wanted to document my thoughts on this somewhere before the remake comes out and changes everything. People often seem to miss a lot of these themes and subtlety, which is a shame because Final Fantasy VII plays with these things especially well. They often talk about what the game is about, and then when someone else has a different answer, they think the other is wrong. The truth is that often one person is simply describing the narrative while the other is describing the plot, or one is describing the driving inner conflict while the other is describing the main external conflict. People only see one aspect and miss a big part of the game because of it, which I find to be a shame. First off, story, plot, and narrative. People often use these interchangeably, and even I am guilty of getting the actual words mixed up at times. But they are all quite distinct concepts, especially in stories with twists, hidden motivations, and unreliable narrators such as Final Fantasy VII. In fact, it is the way that Final Fantasy VII seamlessly combines the three and plays with the audience's expectations that I argue is the reason for its success. So what are they? Story is the set of events and facts that make up the events of the game. It is the factual nature of what happens, told chronologically and in order. For instance, Cloud lives in Nibelheim, Cloud has a neighbor called Tifa, Tifa gets injured, Cloud leaves Nibelheim, Cloud tries to join Soldier. This is the beginning of the story of Cloud in Final Fantasy VII. Story shows us what factually happened. Nothing more, nothing less. Next up is plot. Plot is the thread that runs through the different story points and ties them together. It explains story points and how they are related. While story explains the what of events, the plot explains the why. This is from an in-universe perspective. Understanding the plot means that you understand how the events are taking place and how they are experienced by the characters, and what the place of these events is in their personal character arcs. The condensed start of the plot of Cloud is that the boy has a crush on the girl next door. After said girl gets injured, the boy blames himself for his weakness and leaves town in order to get stronger in the hopes of getting the girl to notice him. Note how this shows the causal chain and motivations that explain the different events. Note also how I didn't mention the characters' names in this description. The reason for that is that the characters' names aren't actually important to the plot. Cloud could be called by any other name and the plot wouldn't change, although the story would. Last up is the narrative, and this is what people have the most difficulties separating. The narrative is how the story and plot are being presented to the viewer in order to guide their beliefs and understanding of the story. It is the lens through which the plot is revealed to us. Narrative is tricky because writers play with it in order to play with the viewer's emotions, to misdirect them or generally direct the viewer's experience. It is the way the creators cause a subjective experience in the viewer, disconnected from the objective facts of the story. This is especially important in stories with a twist, like Final Fantasy VII, because there the narrative is intentionally misleading. For instance, the start of the narrative of Final Fantasy VII concerning Cloud is that Cloud is a soldier first class who is hired by Avalanche to blow up a Mako reactor. We all know that this is objectively false. Cloud is in fact not a soldier first class. When a script has a twist or a mystery, like the mystery of Nibelheim and the twist of Cloud's past, then the designers use the narration to attempt to deceive the viewer into thinking that the plot of the story is one thing, when in actuality it is another. When the narration we are shown shows inconsistencies with the story facts we are discovering, this creates a sense of mystery and unease as we start to doubt our own interpretation. Then, when a twist happens, the fog of the unreliable narrator is lifted, and we can see the plot in its totality. This allows us to recontextualize and place everything that came before it in a new light. For instance, when we discover that Tifa knows that Cloud didn't come to Nibelheim, all the strange behavior she has been exhibiting start to make sense. Actions that were previously thought to indicate one thing can now potentially indicate the exact opposite. Final Fantasy VII does this several times using the Nibelheim incident. It is the central storytelling technique of Final Fantasy VII, which is a classic example of the unreliable narrator. It effectively has three stages. One is the build-up, where our assumed trust in the narrator, in this case Cloud, establishes our views on the events taking place. This is embodied by the first telling of the Nibelheim story. Our understanding of what happened in Nibelheim sets the stage for who we believe Cloud to be. The second stage is doubt. In this part, we, the viewer, start to doubt the narrator, and we are forced to reconsider the validity of what we believe and have been shown. This phase is slowly built up through Cloud's erratic actions and culminates in the second visit to Nibelheim, in Sephiroth's illusion. The third stage is the reveal, where we obtain the crucial piece of the puzzle that allows us to recontextualize and understand everything that came before it. This is the third visit to Nibelheim, where Cloud's feelings for Tifa are established to be the key puzzle piece that drove the plot of Final Fantasy VII, and that allows us to finally see the plot instead of the narrative. It is one of the most shockingly satisfying reveals in narrative media, and one of the reasons why I consider Nibelheim to be one of the greatest narrative devices ever conceived, and Claris fans sadly reject it because they don't like the way it recontextualizes Cloud's interactions with Aerith and Tifa. So next up is internal versus external conflict. This is inspired by someone who said they realized that Final Fantasy VII isn't a love story, but rather a story about saving the planet. This idea confused me because it seems obvious that the one does not preclude the other. But Final Fantasy VII is particularly fond of seemingly changing what the story is about halfway through the story. Examples of this is how the player first believes that the story revolves around taking down Shinra and then changes the focus towards Sephiroth. Too many people, the death of Aerith is seemingly also one such change, where the story changes from a love story with Aerith to either a love story with Tifa or a revenge story. Others believe that this indicates that the entire game has nothing to do with love in general. In reality, the plot of Final Fantasy VII is extremely cohesive. It is not the plot that changes, it is the game's narration suddenly showing us a part of the plot that was at first unseen. And when said narrative seemingly shows a plotline ending in a way we did not expect, closer inspection usually reveals that this is because the narration itself turned out to be misleading. Usually, when attempting to write stories that engage with humans, there are not only multiple stories and character arcs for the different characters, but also a separate internal and external conflict. First, the characters need to resolve their inner conflict, which then grants them some secrets or strength that allows them to resolve the external one. This is the internal character arc, the hero's journey. It is the ways that the characters must change in order to achieve victory. A story that has only external conflicts is generally bland and devoid of any humanity. Neither of the two is the true conflict, and it's only by understanding how the two relate that you get to understand the full picture of the game. Again, this is done extremely well in Final Fantasy VII, where Cloud has a whole host of issues that need to be resolved before the final showdown with Sephiroth can even take place. The brilliance of Final Fantasy VII is the juxtaposition of this grand external world-ending conflict with the simple human story of a boy who felt he needed to become stronger in order to get a girl to notice him. There are lots of debates about who is the heroine of Final Fantasy VII, and this is the answer. Aerith has the role of heroine in the external conflict, the one tasked with saving the planet, and Tifa meanwhile has the role of heroine in the internal conflict, the one who's tasked with saving Cloud's soul. So, how does all this tie into the love triangle and the shipping war? Well, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this and going over the evidence, and the more I think about it, the more I drift towards the idea that there isn't an actual love triangle within the plot of Final Fantasy VII. I think there might be one in the plot of the Final Fantasy VII Remake, because Square Enix is trying to milk the shipping war for all it's worth, and I am not sure they themselves fully understand the plot they created. It might sound arrogant to say that I know Final Fantasy VII better than the people making the remake, but let's not pretend as if creators not understanding what made their original work so great is a rare thing. The world is abound with poor sequels and adaptations. Anyway, because of all this, I felt compelled to make this video before the remake came out, and people will use it to claim then God knows what. I will just preemptively state here that if anything I said clashes with things done in the remake, then that's not most likely an error on my part, but a retcon on the part of the remake. When I really analyze the role of Aerith, both to the plot of the game from an out-of-universe perspective as set out by the creators of Final Fantasy VII, and to the plot of Cloud's love life as experienced by Cloud in-universe, I cannot see any evidence for an actual love triangle existing. Now, don't get me wrong, when we the players are playing the game, we are definitely experiencing a love triangle. However, it is my contention that this love triangle only exists within the narrative of Final Fantasy VII, not within the plot. We the players experience Aerith as a love interest because that's what we are used to. We know the tropes, we see Cloud interacting with her in a pleasant manner. The first 1/3 of the story seems very focused on them, which we through our experiences with media take to mean that this is a love story. Now, this is the narrative as it is set down by Final Fantasy VII. That this is a story of a soldier with two possible love interests. However, I'd argue that all that is a part of the misdirection set out by the plot. In fact, I'd say that the final Nibelheim scene basically shouts that from the rooftops. It literally is the twist, and I find it difficult to understand why people seem to miss it. I think that the problem is that by the time we get there, they are too set in their ways. They don't want to re-evaluate the scenes that have already happened in light of new discoveries from the point of view of the plot. This is especially true if they've already made emotional attachments to certain interpretations of the plot. After all, if you've just spent 10 hours of your life watching a tragic love story that ends in the death of a girl, who on earth would want to be told that the guy didn't actually care about her? You would get extremely defensive. And I have seen some extremely defensive people when it comes to Cloud and Aerith's supposed love story. However, that doesn't change the fact that most arguments made for Aerith and Cloud either turn out to only apply to the narrative of the game, or else completely misrepresent Cloud's internal struggle. This is something that really affects me, because the story of Final Fantasy VII is beautiful, complex, and thoroughly thought out. And by refusing to take a hard look at what the plot tells us about the characters, I feel we are doing it a disservice. In fact, how are we able to call ourselves fans of a story if we are unwilling to accept the story for what it is? We wouldn't be fans if that were the case, we'd be critics, haters even. What we would be a fan of is our own Final Fantasy VII fanfiction. So, having said all that, what do I mean when I say that most arguments for Aerith as a love interest only apply to the narrative, not the plot? Well, let's take an example, juxtaposing what we experience as players through the narrative versus what actually happens from an objective story perspective, devoid of narrative or interpretations. So, let's first start with the elephant in the room, the date. The argument usually goes that Aerith's number of affection points prove that Cloud inherently prefers her and that there is a romantic connection there. There are two possible main dates, ergo a love triangle, and one has more inherent affection points. Therefore, main love interest, right? This argument comes from the narrative and what we expect from games. This is what we, the viewer, experience. We experience Cloud interacting with Aerith and potentially going on a date with her. But when we break down the date and actually look at it from different angles, we see that it is really not that simple. First of all, let's look at it from a purely mechanical perspective. There is the fact that Tifa is more shy and reserved than Aerith, and therefore less likely to barge in for a date character-wise. Just assuming that the default affection points are different because of an actual difference in affection and not there to reflect the increase in difficulty is a meta-argument that doesn't actually transfer logically to emotions felt by the characters in-universe. From a game design perspective, there is no difference between starting with a lower number or requiring a higher number. You'd always use the first because it's easier to code. You could make both girls start with 50 affection and then say Tifa gets the date if she beats Aerith affection score by 20, but making her start with 30 has the same effect and requires less code. So you can't make a deduction about their actual feelings based on it. The most you could say is that the designers of the game wanted to nudge you in the direction of going on a date with Aerith. However, when making that argument, you are once again arguing that the narrative the designers want you to experience is that there is a love triangle. Just like the narration wanted you to experience that you were a soldier first class. It doesn't logically translate to any feelings the characters themselves might have within the plot, especially since we know the narrative of Final Fantasy VII is trying to trick us. Secondly, we can look at it from the perspective of the character's emotions in-universe. We see that the affection points are not indicative of how much Cloud likes a girl, but how much said girl likes him. We see this in situations like if Aerith is chosen as Don Corneo's date. If you ask Tifa, "Are you alright?" you will lose 2 points with Tifa, while saying "we gotta help Aerith" grants you 3 points with Tifa. If the affection points were to reflect who you care about more, then those would be reversed. This is also why you can gain favor with Tifa by showing weakness when you are about to drop from the plate, even though Cloud specifically thinks that the way to get Tifa to notice him is by pretending to be strong. By the way, this theme of Cloud thinking he needs to be strong and Tifa just wanting him to open up will come back throughout every part of the plot of Final Fantasy VII. Then there's also the fact that Cloud doesn't initiate the date. Someone just knocks on his door and he is forced to go on a date with whoever is there. So the date itself can't represent any preference from the side of Cloud. And from the side of Tifa, calling back to the earlier point, we know that she is less likely to initiate a date, and therefore the fact that she is less likely to initiate a date in the game can't be used as a reflection of her feelings for Cloud. Next, we can look at it from a plot versus narration perspective. The designers know Aerith is going to die. They know they only have 1/3 of the game to get you as invested in her as possible. They know they want to play with your emotions and expectations. It seems clear that the game is trying to maximize all this by presenting Aerith as a possible love interest in the narrative. But it's a non sequitur to say that this means she is also a love interest from the point of view of the characters. She could be, but inclusion of the date and the illusion of a love triangle within the narrative can't be used to prove that. You need actual story points if you want to make that claim, otherwise it's just as fallacious as saying Cloud is a soldier because the narrative clearly presented him as a soldier. Aerith as a love interest might not be as conclusively disproven, however, it shows that the narrative itself cannot be used to prove something either way. Or in other words, when people say the designers clearly intended for you to see her as a potential love interest, they are correct. Just like the designers clearly intended for you to see Cloud as a soldier first class. The fact that the designers are trying to guide our emotions does not in itself prove anything outside of the narrative. It does not translate to the plot. So what is the narrative of Final Fantasy VII when it comes to romance? The romance narrative of Final Fantasy VII is what is presented to the player. We discover that Cloud is a soldier who is helping a girl he knew from childhood, Tifa. We later discover another girl, Aerith, who seems like the opposite of said girl. One is shy and one is flirty. We see Cloud spend some time with Aerith and we can say things that would appeal to either girl. The game presents us with the ability to try and woo either one. In the beginning of the game, more focus is given to Aerith and we notice there's something off in some of Cloud's interactions with Tifa, but we are not sure what it is. During this time, we develop a bond with this new girl. However, tragedy strikes and the potential love interest dies. Focus now switches to Tifa and we get more scenes of them together. But there is still some secret there that we don't know about that is making us feel uneasy. The atmosphere with Tifa isn't as carefree as it was with Aerith, and some of us think that this is a sign that Aerith was our supposed love interest. The more we see, the more we discover that there is something terrible in Tifa and Cloud's past that we don't know. Eventually, Tifa travels into Cloud's subconscious and unravels the true plot of Final Fantasy VII. It's this narrative that causes people to ship Aerith and Cloud. because the narrative represents the feelings as the player is playing the game. It is not based on reality, but rather the player's perception of it. It is a classic mistake people make when trying to assess the story of a game, substituting what actually happened with what they experienced. Next up, we can talk about the story perspective. What actually happens in the story? In the story, Aerith meets Cloud and he reminds her of her ex-boyfriend. She travels with him for about a week, and depending on how Cloud is acting, either Aerith or Tifa takes him on a date in the Golden Saucer. If the date is with Aerith, she will bring up her ex-boyfriend again and mention how she wants to meet the real you. If the date is with Tifa, she will attempt to make some sort of confession to you. Purely on the face of it, neither of these are grand romantic events if we remove the lens of playing a game. We experience the statements of both women as romantic through the lens of the narrative. On the surface, Aerith's comments concerning Cloud looking like Zack mean seemingly no more than that Cloud reminds her of him, that she should stop comparing him to Zack and move on, and that she thinks Cloud is not really being himself, and that she'd like to get to find out what he's really like. Meanwhile, Tifa's words are seemingly a straightforward attempt at confessing her feelings. However, when the plot is later revealed, we can look back and interpret both dates quite differently. From the plot, we know that Cloud is literally pretending to be Zack, and we know that Aerith was a little more in touch with things than we initially believed. Looking at the scene a second time, we realize that Aerith is actually concerned that there is something really weird going on with Cloud, and that the focus of her dialogue might not be to establish a romantic relationship, but in fact to determine if she should go deeper into this mystery or just let it go. Tifa's dialogue can also be interpreted differently a second time. Aside from being a possible confession, there's also the possibility that she's trying to bring up Cloud's faulty memories and what really happened in Nibelheim. This dynamic is very prevalent throughout Final Fantasy VII, where the narrative baits the player into assuming that there's a romantic connection with Aerith and an awkward one with Tifa, when really the plot is the actual thing that explains why those interactions are the way they are. Interactions with Tifa aren't weird because she's not a romantic interest. The interactions are weird because of the hidden backstory between the two. I won't go into every detail of Final Fantasy VII to this degree, suffice it to say that there is nothing in the actual story that reasonably leads you to the conclusion that a Cloud-Aerith love story is anything more than a very remote hypothetical. The two girls are relatively equally represented in the narration of Final Fantasy VII, but when it comes to their representation within the plot of Final Fantasy VII, and especially the story of Cloud, there is simply no comparison. Going through it naturally leads to my earlier conclusion. Aerith is the heroine of the external conflict, Tifa is the heroine of the internal one. Aerith is the first face and the last face you see in the game, not counting after credits. So she feels like a big presence within the game and thus Cloud's life, but in reality the entire story of Final Fantasy VII, from the bombing run to the death of Sephiroth, only takes about 1 month, and in that time Aerith is only around for 1 week, during which she spends one afternoon alone with Cloud saving Tifa, is subsequently kidnapped, and then after reuniting in Shinra HQ she spends 4 days with him and company traveling. They then have potentially 1 day together where she brings up Zack and says that she hopes to one day meet the real Cloud. Then the next day they go to the Temple of the Ancients where Cloud beats her up and leaves her to go save the planet. That is the objective extent of their interactions together. From a purely common sense standpoint, we have to say that this not exactly explicit 1 week of mostly one-sided flirting is not exactly the strongest evidence for true love that we've ever seen. However, we do know that Aerith is an important motivator when it comes to the plot, to the why of Cloud's actions. Although her time was brief, we know she had a big impact on Cloud. So what could that be if not for love? Well, for that we first need to explain who Cloud really is, and for that we need Tifa. Let's talk about Cloud's story as it regards to Tifa. Not the narrative, but the actual events that take place in Cloud's life and Tifa's role within the plot as it pertains to Cloud. Cloud has known Tifa ever since they were young. She was the girl next door, and he had a crush on her. She, however, was oblivious to these feelings and never really spent too much time with him. She had lots of friends, and while she thought her and Cloud were close, he was never really a part of her inner circle. Cloud, being a bit of a social dweeb, did not know how to get Tifa's attention and started developing a bit of a complex. After Tifa's mother dies, he follows her up a mountain, resulting in them falling and her almost dying. Ashamed of his own weakness and failure to protect her, Cloud starts acting out, getting into fights, etc. Eventually he hears of Sephiroth and Soldier, and decided to join in the hopes that being strong would cause Tifa to notice him. And in a way it did. He asked her to the well, told her of his plans, and she asked him to promise to come save her if ever she was in trouble, like a knight in shining armor. From this, we can see that throughout Cloud's childhood, Tifa was a main motivator for his actions. We can also see that this is presented explicitly by the plot as being romantic. Young and undeveloped, of course, at this point, but romantic. We also see the second part of Cloud's identity forming here. Cloud feels that strength is the solution to winning Tifa's heart. He feels guilty that he could not protect her on the mountain. He is ashamed for his own weakness and mistakenly believes Tifa hates him for it. At this point, Cloud is established to have romantic feelings for Tifa. However, the relationship cannot be because he has not expressed them, and they are, as of yet, unrequited. At this point, Tifa has a strong enough presence in his identity that he joins the army just in the hopes of getting her to notice him. After he leaves, Tifa can't quite shake the memory of Cloud. She starts thinking about him, wondering what he's doing, looking for articles about him, etc. When Soldier comes to Nibelheim 2 years later, she waits for them, hoping to see him again. At this point, the plot establishes Tifa to have a romantic interest in Cloud. Also still young and innocent? Still, but strong enough that she pines for him for over 2 full years. There is still no relationship though, since the two are apart and unaware of each other's feelings. Cloud doesn't know Tifa has developed a crush on him, Tifa didn't know Cloud left because of his crush on her. So after 2 years, when Cloud returns to Nibelheim, he cannot face Tifa, because he feels like a failure. The plot tells us that Cloud still has feelings for Tifa, which prevent him from being honest with her. A relationship doesn't start here because Cloud's feelings of shame and inadequacy prevent him from confessing his feelings. Notice how once again Cloud's actions are motivated by 2 things. 1. Romantic feelings for Tifa. 2. Feelings of inadequacy and failure. Then Nibelheim happens. Sephiroth burns down the entire town and massacres the townspeople. Cloud tries to stop him but is too late and Tifa is struck down. In Cloud's head, he failed to keep his promise. Cloud stabs Sephiroth, then gets stabbed himself, and in an effort of pure will, throws Sephiroth into the livestream. This is the point where the simple love plot becomes more complicated. Cloud and Zack are immediately taken prisoner and thrown in Mako tanks, where Cloud's mind is muddled and mixed up with memories of Zack for 4 years. After they escape, Zack dies defending Cloud, and it is at this point that the plot truly thickens. Cloud, filled with sadness, grief, shame and anger, feels that his own weakness is the cause for all of the bad things that have happened. Tifa getting injured, Nibelheim burning, Zack dying. To Cloud, it's all his fault. This pain, combined with the Mako energy messing with his mind, causes Cloud to develop an alter ego, one cobbled together from the memories of Zack and his own preconceived notions of what a soldier should be: strong, cool, cold, etc. Cloud hides from the painful truth of who he really is, and in late September of year 7, Zack Cloud is born. From this moment on, it's important to note that Zack Cloud's actions are no longer representative of who Cloud himself is as a person, but representative of a fantasy he's created in his mind. Therefore, any following events have to be judged with that in mind. I also want to point out that this fake persona stems from negative emotions that were already extremely present in Cloud, only taken to their extreme, blotting out who he really is. We will see later that while his negative motivators are what cause him to create a fake version of himself, getting back to his true self is achieved by once again embracing his positive motivators, namely his feelings for Tifa. After Zack dies, Zack Cloud stumbles back to Midgar and is found by Tifa. I would call this destiny, but I am writing this from the perspective of actual plot, not tropes, so I won't. I will point out, however, that the game consistently establishes Tifa's omnipresence when it comes to her impact on Cloud's life. This happens in October. At this point, time has not really passed for Zack Cloud, who doesn't really remember anything about the past 5 years. But Tifa has not been idle. She has learned martial arts and joined Avalanche as a way to get revenge on Shinra. For her, this is the first time she's seen Cloud in 7 years. However, when she realizes she's going to lose him again, she decides she doesn't want that. She takes him in, notices there is something wrong, and decides she needs to find out what. She convinces him to help her with the reactor bombing run in December. Cue the start of the game. The plot here presents Tifa as having complicated feelings about Cloud that she doesn't know how to handle. There's already been books worth of romantic plot between them, and the actual game hasn't even started yet. At this point, the plot has established a boat's worth of baggage, character definitions and motivations, etc. that all need to be unpacked. For the romantic plot, this is the low point of Tifa and Cloud. Tifa doesn't know what is going on, nor how to bring up her feelings or the event that happened to them, and Cloud is not himself, pretending to be the cool, uncaring soldier that he once thought would get Tifa to notice him. It is this metric ton of backstory that sets the stage for the following few weeks, and allows the narration to portray Aerith and Tifa on equal footing as potential love interests in the eyes of the player. December arrives and the mission commences. The reactor explodes, Cloud is firmly being a soldier, Tifa is worried, but all the baggage between them makes it hard for them to communicate. She decides to wait a little longer and see what happens. Cloud stays because of his promise to Tifa, and some more time passes and the number 5 reactor explodes mid-December. So, I've mostly gone over the week with Aerith, but I'll quickly go over it again from the new perspective. Now, the new week is important, because it's the only week that fans of Cloud and Aerith have. By the end of December, Aerith will be long dead, Meteor will have been summoned, and Cloud will once again be in a catatonic state of Mako poisoning. Zack Cloud falls in a church and meets Aerith, who is reminded of the ex-boyfriend Cloud is mimicking. The narration presents this as love at first sight. The plot represents this as Aerith being slightly hung up on Zack and intrigued by the strange similarities between the two. I think this is a good time to point out that Final Fantasy VII tries to subvert expectations, especially with Aerith's character. Her death is presented as being final, a sort of reality check that teaches the player a harsh truth, and this concept would be very thematically at odds with the fairy tale concept of true love at first sight. Aerith decides to spend some more time with Zack Cloud. They run from the Turks, go to her place, and Zack Cloud leaves. Aerith heads him off and they have a moment in the playground. Aerith inquires about Zack, and then we are greeted with the sight of Tifa being brought to the dawn. Within both the plot and the narrative, this is presented as being flirty on the side of Aerith, which is not that strange. Jessie is flirty too when just meeting Cloud. However, the plot adds in the fact that Aerith's initial interests are not in Cloud, but the fake persona Zack Cloud, and is motivated by her previous love. Interestingly, Zack Cloud has the option to say that Tifa is his girlfriend, although neither option really matters to the plot as it pertains to Cloud. So Zack Cloud and Aerith go save Tifa, and have a cute few hours together in Wall Market that the narration leads you to believe is possibly the start of a budding romance, but from a plot perspective, it's just a few hours between two people who could just as well be friends. Although the narrative portrays these interactions as genuine, the actual plot reveals that this is definitely not the case. At this point, neither Aerith nor Cloud is truly earnest. In case of Aerith, she has hidden motivations, and the person she is interacting with isn't faithfully representing themselves. Cloud is being Zack Cloud. They proceed to save Tifa, and Cloud is embarrassed to be seen by her in a dress. The two girls hit it off straight away. Plot-wise, I don't think him being embarrassed is extremely notable, but it is still noticeable. Anyway, this is really where the love triangle in the narration starts. However, from a plot perspective, we can't really say that Aerith is really more than potentially a distant blip on the radar in Cloud's life when it comes to romance. The initiative comes from Aerith, she is motivated by the memory of Zack, and the person she is interested in isn't being himself. And even if Zack Cloud was shown enthusiastically trying to pursue Aerith, we still couldn't really transfer that towards the feelings of the actual Cloud. People argue that Aerith eventually loved Cloud more than Zack, and while it is debatable whether or not that's true, it's certainly not true here, 1 hour after they've met, and when Cloud isn't Cloud but Zack Cloud. You can't say that Aerith loves Cloud's real personality when she doesn't know his real personality. So, for the next week, Zack Cloud, Tifa and Aerith all travel together, and the question is if there is anything that happens in the plot during that 1 week that is particularly interesting when it comes to Zack Cloud's affections. And the truth is, not really. Aerith is abducted, the plate drops, they go travel across the planet, and eventually end up at the Golden Saucer. What we mainly see in this week is narration. We get to see Zack Cloud interact with Tifa, and have it sometimes look a bit odd. And we see him interact with Aerith, and sometimes have it be a bit flirty. The narration lets us believe that this is an indication of romance. Plot teaches us that this is the result of plot. Regardless, when we reach the date, Aerith and Tifa are both good and well confused about what is going on with Zack Cloud. Temple of the Ancients happens, Aerith realizes that Zack Cloud needs to focus on his own issues and decides not to burden him any further. She goes off on her own and leaves him one last message not to worry so much and to take care of himself first. This moment is perhaps the first hint in the actual narration about the position of Aerith within the plot. On the one hand, there is Cloud's mental state. On the other side, there is the planet. Aerith chooses to go save the planet. Sure, letting Cloud come with her would be even worse for his mental state, but that's the point. That wasn't her battle to fight. That wasn't her character's role within the plot. After that, the group follows Aerith, and she dies. And Cloud is left, still as Zack Cloud, once again having failed to protect someone because of his weakness. So, from a narrative perspective, we are now shown a grieving Cloud, mourning someone who he might have had feelings for. But from a plot perspective, we see history repeating itself, and Cloud once again being filled by negative thoughts of inadequacy. After this, the narration switches focus to Tifa. Cloud is understandably upset at his continual failure to save anyone ever and proceeds to go after Sephiroth. After following him through the mountains and learning how to snowboard, Cloud meets up with Sephiroth in the northern crater, only to be shown an illusion of Nibelheim. From a love plot perspective, not that much is happening here, besides that the plot we already knew is slowly being revealed. Zack Cloud has an identity crisis. He tells Tifa her opinion is the only one that matters, along with some other obviously romantic sentiments, and from a plot perspective, this makes sense. It was always Tifa, all the time, for Cloud. However, from a narrative stance, this comes a bit out of the blue to players who'd been trying to woo Aerith. Cloud is being chummy with Tifa, and Tifa, meanwhile, is in full panic mode begging Cloud not to listen to Sephiroth. However, Tifa can't confirm Cloud's version of the Nibelheim incident, which causes Cloud to lose his last grip on his humanity. He gives the black materia to Sephiroth and begs Hojo for a number, having lost all and any sense of identity. This is the last act of Zack Cloud, and the plot puts Tifa right there, the original instigator for his internal struggle, and when he apparently loses his connection to her, he finally loses his sense of who he is. This all takes place within roughly 2 weeks after the start of the game. Here, both the narration and the plot are enforcing the Tifa/Cloud connection. From a narrative perspective, this is all potentially unexpected. From a plot perspective, this was all inevitable. Zack Cloud proceeds to fall into the livestream, and Tifa is knocked unconscious, only to wake up a week later in January. We now jump into the role of Tifa as a player, and the narration shows us how she experienced the plot. The narration tells us about her finding Cloud, about knowing his memories were mistaken, about her trying to bring it up and trying to be with him, etc. She talks about missing him and needing him, and the narration heavily implies that these are romantic feelings. From a plot perspective, we already know all this, and we know that the feelings are definitely romantic. Tifa finds Cloud in a catatonic state and is presented with the same choice Aerith faced earlier. To either leave Cloud safe in someone else's hands and go save the planet, or else leave the planet in someone else's hand and stay with Cloud. And opposite of Aerith, Tifa chooses to stay with Cloud. In doing so, her role in Final Fantasy VII is established as the heroine in the story of Cloud's inner struggle. The two proceed to fall into the livestream, and here, finally, the narration gives way to plot. The viewer is shown the plot as it is, without false narration, only to reveal that it was Tifa all along. Like Cloud's feelings for Tifa are what originally set the entire plot in motion, they are now what allow him to once again discover who he really is. He is reminded of his positive motivations, not the feelings of guilt and inadequacy that caused him to become emo Cloud, but his tender feelings for Tifa. It's these feelings that were so core and fundamental to who he is. that allow him to find himself again. Tifa, meanwhile, is shown that Cloud was there for her 5 years ago when she needed him most, and kept his promise. Cloud's self is restored, he tells Tifa we finally meet again, and after a lifetime of orbiting around each other, the star-crossed lovers finally come together. Tifa and Cloud meet underneath the High Wind the night before the final battle and finally confirm their feelings for each other, with tender feelings locked inside Cloud's heart for Tifa Lockhart. And that is the plot of the love story of Final Fantasy VII. Tifa is present as a motivator for Cloud throughout his entire life, with there only being 2 months where this effect is seemingly lessened. These are the 2 months that the game takes place in, and it's where the 1 week with Aerith takes place. The more I've thought about it, the more clear it becomes to me that the Aerith romance subplot is a subplot within the narrative, and is mostly a misdirection from the actual love plot. The truth is that while Aerith's death has a major impact on Cloud's life, stemming from his pre-existing inadequacies concerning the failure to become a soldier or to save Nibelheim, Zack, and to a lesser extent Tifa, the actual impact she had as a romantic partner is minimal. The thing that defines Aerith's influence on Cloud isn't that she was the woman he loved who is now dead. The thing that defines Aerith's influence most is that she is dead and Cloud feels directly responsible. That is the important part. It is a constant reminder of his own weakness and failure. That is her place in the story of Final Fantasy VII as it relates to Cloud, as a source of guilt, not as a love interest, no matter how much people want it to be. That simply doesn't happen in 1 or max 2 dates over a single week during which a person is not themselves. When it comes to Cloud's love life, Aerith was never more than a stranger passing by, but when it comes to his innermost turmoils, she is the person he feels he failed the most. By trying to focus on the romance aspect, people are diminishing her importance to the story. Sure, Aerith is important to Cloud, and is a motivator. We see it in Advent Children. His guilt over her death are part of those negative emotions that have always been a factor in Cloud's life, and are constantly struggling against the positive motivator, his love for Tifa, and his desire to protect the things he cherishes. This is the Cloud plot of Advent Children, and basically all Final Fantasy VII spin-off. Cloud struggles with guilt and regret, and it's why the focus is never on settling, but on forgiving himself. Cloud's struggles aren't as pedantic and poorly written as having to settle for second choice. He doesn't have to learn to live with Tifa, he needs to learn to live with himself. Or, as Aerith would say,
dilly-dally, shilly-shally. Isn't it time you did the forgiving?
This is the plot of Final Fantasy VII. I think I've done a pretty good job representing it, and I don't think there's much people can do to argue against it, but it's not the final nail in the coffin of the Aerith and Cloud ship. It's the first 1/3 of the game where Cloud never even kisses Aerith, or makes love to her, or tells her he loves her, or instigates any romantic interactions of any kind with her, but causes people to ignore the following 2/3 of the game, where it's discovered that Cloud had literal brain damage during the time he spent with her, which actually caused him to act like her ex-boyfriend. They ignore the part of the game where we discover Tifa has been Cloud's literal motivation his entire life, part of the game where we discover that his feelings for Tifa are so fundamentally defining for who he is that it literally allows him to separate his own personality from Zack's. You would think that to reveal that Aerith fell in love with a dude because he was pretending he was someone he was not, namely her ex, and that the thing that got the true Cloud, as Aerith liked to call him, back were his feelings for Tifa, would be enough to make even a blind man go, wow, that's maybe a bit too clear. But you should never underestimate how strongly people want to believe that Aerith was Cloud's love interest, because when the game refuses to be what they want it to be, they'll just go looking for confirmation elsewhere. And what they come back with broadly falls into one of 3 categories: hypotheticals, confirmation bias, and personal preference. Now I will quickly address each before I leave here, but not with the same elaborate analysis, there's only so much time in a day, and the things I have talked about previously can be used to pretty much discredit any possible counter arguments without much adjusting anyway. The first thing I'd like to mention is hypotheticals. Sometimes Aerith shippers hide their ship away in hypotheticals, saying things like, if Aerith had lived, then Cloud would have ended up with her. This shows that she was his true love all along. Or they'll mention how Aerith was originally supposed to be the love interest during earlier drafts of the story, you know, just like she was at one point Sephiroth's sister and at one point dating him. Now, personally, I don't put much stock in true love, whatever that means. In real life, if someone meets someone for 1 week and then never moves on from that person, we tend to call that an unhealthy obsession and say that that's not true love, that it's insulting to compare the two. That having been said, I think it's hard to argue that Cloud, in his regular mindset, would prefer Aerith over Tifa. At the very least, we have no evidence for it. I think the plot, as I laid it out, pretty much shouts Cloud's love preferences from the heavens. I guess you could say that yes, if this were real life and not a game, and if things had gone differently, then things would have gone differently. However, I also believe that if our world had gone differently, I could have ended up with Scarlett Johansson, only I didn't. The very fact that you have to add, if things were different, means that what you are talking about is not how things are. I personally think Cloud could have been happy with Aerith, Tifa, Jessie, or any other woman in Final Fantasy VII, depending on how much of reality you change to accommodate it. It's simply a non-argument, but for the sake of it, I've actually gone over some of the more obvious changes and determined how I think it would have turned out. First off, let's address the elephant in the room here. Aerith is dead, which means this is always a hypothetical, because we know what happens with Aerith, and we know who Cloud ends up with. And if you think anyone would love a person they've spent their entire lives with less than a person they knew for 1 week while not being themselves, you are not being honest with yourself. I don't care if her private parts were made out of gold and she shed rainbows. Humans simply don't operate like that. This means that the best question the Claire shippers can ask is, would Cloud have ended up with Aerith had she survived? So if it's a hypothetical anyway, I think there's more we should take into account. In my opinion, there are 8 main branching paths, based on 3 main defining events. 1. Who you, the player, chooses to be nice to. 2. Does Aerith die? 3. Does Cloud regain his memories? We could go back further, of course. If Zack didn't die, for instance, there would be no chance in hell of Aerith and Cloud ever ending up loving each other, but let's not go down that road yet. Purely from a practical standpoint, this is what I think would happen had the story progressed differently. 1. Player is nice to Aerith, Aerith dies, Cloud regains his memories, Cloud ends up loving Tifa. 2. Player is nice to Tifa, Aerith dies, Cloud regains his memories, Cloud ends up loving Tifa. These were the 2 possible canon endings to Final Fantasy VII. Both end up with Cloud loving Tifa. In one, he makes love with Tifa underneath the High Wind, in the other he confesses love to her underneath the High Wind, and they probably make love 2 weeks later. Again, this is both the plot as it's presented by Final Fantasy VII, as well as simply how reality works. People don't devote their entire life to a girl, then when they finally get her, waste the rest of their life pining after some other girl they barely met. Next option, the player is nice to Aerith and Aerith survives and Cloud regains his memories. The chances of Cloud ending up with Tifa or Aerith are about 50-50 here, I'd say. Honestly, I'd still give the edge to Tifa. A lifetime of living for a person and then being saved by your love for them generally trumps being nice to someone for a week. Next option, number 4, the player is nice to Tifa and Aerith survives and Cloud regains his memories. And Cloud pretty obviously ends up loving Tifa. Next option, option 5, the player is nice to Aerith, Aerith survives, and Cloud doesn't regain his memories. This is the best possible route for Aerith. I'd say the chances of Cloud ending up with Aerith or Tifa are about 75-25 in favor of Aerith. 6th option is the player is nice to Tifa, Aerith survives, and Cloud doesn't regain his memories. Here I'd say there's a 75% chance in favor of Tifa, this being extremely generous to Aerith. Those are all the options where Aerith survives. In 250 of 400 of these cases, I see Cloud ending up loving Tifa more than Aerith. And the other 150 times are mostly because of brain damage and are therefore indicative of Zack Cloud's true love, not Cloud. This is what the Claire shippers build their hopes on. For their ship to have a chance at working, Cloud can't be himself. The last 2 options are these. Number 7, the player is nice to Aerith and Aerith dies and Cloud doesn't regain his memories. This will end with Cloud loving Tifa more than he did Aerith, eventually. Again, this is simple, practical realities. No one loves the girl they knew for 1 week and never even kissed more than they'll love the smoking hot Asian chick that they're banging on the daily for God knows how many years. 8, player is nice to Tifa, Aerith dies, Cloud doesn't regain his memories, Cloud ends up loving Tifa. So basically in 7 out of 8 scenarios I'd peg Tifa to be Cloud's true love, whatever that means. And in the other scenario, I don't think Cloud is Cloud. Bonus round. Zack survives. Zack and Cloud go to Midgar. Cloud does not have an identity crisis. Zack ends up with Aerith, who becomes friendly with Cloud but never romantic. Cloud meets up back with Tifa. They become romantic sooner than in the game because there is not this secret between them. And all 4 become amazing friends because Zack is there and Cloud doesn't have an identity crisis. Aerith doesn't go off on her own to get killed. Neither does Cloud give the black materia to Sephiroth. The world is safe and they all live happily ever after. Oh damn, now I'm sad. I want to see pictures of all 4 of them in 7th Heaven. Oh well. Anyway, that is the sad reality of the Claire ship. Ultimately, they're trying to convince people that Cloud loves Aerith more than Tifa because she potentially forced him into a date in the week of his life where he literally believed himself to be her ex-boyfriend. Which is also the one week where things were also so awkward with Tifa because she had a history with him that prevented them from being honest with each other. Think about that. Think about the sheer number of advantages Aerith had in that one week and the sheer number of disadvantages Tifa had. Throughout Tifa's and Cloud's life together, this would have been the time where they were most distant from each other emotionally, which actually stayed in the game. And the one week where Cloud would be more naturally drawn towards Aerith than any other week. So it's the high point of love potential between Cloud and Aerith, and the low point of love potential between Cloud and Tifa. And it is still a toss-up between the two who he liked more during this week. That is how sadly outclassed Aerith is when it comes to Cloud's affections in the original game. So if hypotheticals don't work, they will try to quote mine statements from external sources, sometimes from spin-offs, sometimes from creatives, sometimes even from commercials to justify an interpretation of the story that is not sustained by either the game or common sense. Here you will hear things like, the commercial called them a love that could never be. Setting aside the fact that if a love can never be, then that means that it isn't. This is a classic example of not understanding the differences between plot and narrative. Trailers are their own unique narratives that have only one goal, to sell copies. It has nothing to say about the actual plot of the game. Something else you will see are dozens of quote-mine statements from Ultimanias or from developers. None of this is in the game, and each statement you can also find one that contradicts it. Some are personal opinions, some are developers straight up misremembering what the game was. I've seen pages and pages of people trying to throw obscure statements towards each other, and in the end I realized that this way madness lies. If you can't defend your ship by using the actual game, your ship has sailed. And finally, the last defense. They admit that they have no argument and that Tifa is indeed Cloud's love interest, but that they simply like the Aerith ship better. I technically have no problem with this stance, and as long as people don't misrepresent this stance as being what is actually happening in the plot, I'm fine with them continuing to ship it. However, I do hope that this video gets them to reconsider, because I really feel like they are missing out on one of the greatest love stories in fiction. I honestly believe that the Clotty love story written by Square Enix is just objectively better written than the Claire fanfiction. So I invite any Aerith lover to take some time and try to appreciate the story of Tifa and Cloud as I have presented it. If there's anything Cloud has taught us, it's how dangerous it can be to refuse to accept reality. So please, take this key and open that lock to your heart.